Officer Jack Stevens had been on patrol for only 6 months, but he already believed he had it all figured out. The thrill of wearing the uniform, the authority that came with the badge, and the power to enforce the law made him feel invincible. As a rookie in a small town, Jack was eager to prove himself, to show that he was more than just the new guy. He was determined to stand out. Unfortunately, his eagerness often led him to misjudge situations, and at times, people. It was a sunny Tuesday afternoon, the kind of day that invited crowds into the downtown area, strolling the streets and filling the local shops. Jack was on foot patrol, his eyes scanning the sidewalks for any sign of trouble. He had just passed a small cafe when his gaze landed on a woman standing outside a jewelry store, seemingly lost in thought. She was in her late 30s, dressed in a simple, unremarkable outfit, jeans, and a t-shirt. Her long brown hair was pulled back in a loose ponytail, and she appeared to be looking at the display window of the jewelry store. Jack's instinct told him she was up to no good. He couldn't explain why, but something about the woman just didn't sit right with him. Maybe it was the way she lingered outside the expensive store without any apparent purpose. Maybe it was her unkempt appearance. Her clothes didn't scream wealth, which in his mind meant she didn't belong near the upscale shops. Whatever the reason, he was ready to act. Approaching her, Jack straightened his posture and cleared his throat. "Can I help you with something, ma'am?" he asked, his voice sharp, with just the right hint of authority. The woman turned toward him slowly, her expression calm, almost serene, but Jack could see the tension in her posture. "I'm just looking," she replied quietly, her voice soft but steady. Jack wasn't satisfied with her answer. To him, it seemed like an excuse, a way to avoid interacting with the law. He took a step closer, his gaze unwavering. "Looking. This is a private property area. If you're not planning on buying anything, I suggest you move along," he said, his tone now laced with condescension. The woman blinked, her eyes briefly flicking down to the ground before meeting his again. "I'm not causing any trouble," she said, her voice still calm, but a subtle edge of defensiveness crept in. Jack's temper flared. He wasn't about to let someone ignore him, not when he was trying to assert his authority. "I don't care what you're doing. I said move along," he insisted, his words growing sharper. The woman didn't flinch, but Jack could sense that her patience was starting to wear thin. The bystanders around them were starting to notice, and Jack could feel the pressure to make a quick decision. Without thinking, Jack reached out to take her arm. "I said," he began, but before he could finish, the woman pulled her arm away with surprising strength. Jack's grip faltered, and for a brief moment, their eyes locked. She didn't say anything, but there was something in her gaze that stopped him. He could see the anger simmering behind her calm exterior, the kind of anger that had been buried under years of frustrations from being underestimated, overlooked, and mistreated. But Jack wasn't willing to see it. "You don't know who you're dealing with," Jack muttered under his breath, his irritation now visible. The woman's face remained expressionless. "I think you're mistaken," she said simply, then turned to walk away, her movements deliberate and controlled. Jack stood there for a moment, his hands still hovering in the air, his chest rising and falling with frustration. He watched her retreating figure, convinced that she was just another person trying to play the system, another person who thought they could get away with disrespecting authority. As she walked down the sidewalk, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, but he brushed it off. People didn't need reasons to act out in his town. They just needed to be dealt with. His mind shifted back to his patrol, his focus on finding someone else to prove his worth to. What Jack didn't know was that the woman, Clara Matthews, was not the person he thought she was. She was not some random stranger in need of correction. She wasn't a nobody. And she certainly wasn't someone to be easily dismissed. What Jack didn't realize yet was that his quick decision to humiliate her on the sidewalk would set off a chain of events that would change both his life and his career forever. The moment he dismissed her, he dismissed everything that mattered most. But Clara's life was about to intersect with his in a way that would force him to confront his own arrogance and the consequences of his actions. Clara didn't react outwardly, but inside, her heart raced. She had been through enough in her life to know when to pick her battles. She didn't deserve this, but the last thing she wanted was to make a scene. The humiliation stung, but it would be the last thing she'd allow to define her. Still, as she walked away, she couldn't help but wonder if she would ever have to confront the consequences of Officer Stevens' behavior. Would he even know who she was? Would he understand the weight of his actions, or would he simply brush it off, convinced that he had the right to treat her that way? For now, she decided to stay silent. But that would soon change. The next morning, Officer Jack Stevens woke up with the usual rush of excitement that came with wearing the uniform. It was still early, the sun barely cresting over the horizon, but he felt invigorated as he suited up, preparing for another day of proving his worth. His mind was on the usual things: patrol routes, ticket quotas, and maybe catching a glimpse of trouble to tackle. But one incident from yesterday nagged at the back of his mind. Clara Matthews, the woman he had humiliated outside the jewelry store. There was something about her that had stuck with him. He couldn't explain why, but her calm demeanor in the face of his authority troubled him. He had expected her to protest, to argue, but instead, she had simply walked away. It bothered him that she hadn't fought back. It made him feel like he had missed something important, but he pushed the thought aside. He was a cop, and he had more pressing matters to deal with. Clara, on the other hand, had spent the night in reflection. The humiliation she had endured was still fresh, but she was used to such treatment. She had learned long ago that being a woman, and a black woman at that, often meant facing judgment from those who didn't take the time to understand her. But there was more to Clara than met the eye. She wasn't just anyone. She was married to Thomas Matthews, the police chief of a neighboring town. While Thomas kept his professional life separate from his personal one, Clara had made a conscious choice to live a quiet, unassuming life away from the spotlight. She wasn't interested in being treated differently because of her husband's position. She wanted to be seen for who she was, not for who she was married to. But the incident yesterday had forced her to reconsider her quiet approach. That morning, she found herself standing in front of the mirror, looking at the woman she had been forced to hide for so long. The woman who had been made invisible, dismissed, and underestimated. The woman who had learned how to remain calm, even when others didn't show her the same respect. But now, after what had happened with Officer Stevens, she couldn't stay silent any longer. She needed to make a decision that would not only impact her, but could also change the course of Jack Stevens' career. As Clara sat down to have breakfast with Thomas, her mind was elsewhere. Thomas noticed her preoccupation, his brow furrowing with concern. He knew something was bothering her, but chose not to press. Clara had always been strong, always dealt with things on her own, but he could sense the weight in her silence. "Clara, what's going on?" he asked, his voice gentle but firm. Clara sighed and looked up at him, her eyes meeting his with a mixture of resolve and weariness. "I had an encounter with one of your officers yesterday," she said quietly. Thomas raised an eyebrow, surprised. "One of my officers? What happened?" Clara recounted the events of the previous day, her voice steady as she relayed how Officer Stevens had approached her, how he had treated her with such disrespect, assuming she didn't belong in that part of town. She didn't leave out the part about him grabbing her arm, though she could sense Thomas' growing tension as she spoke. "He humiliated me, Thomas, in front of everyone. And for what? Because I was standing outside a store," she finished, her voice a little stronger now, tinged with the anger she had held back. Thomas' face darkened as he listened, his fingers tightening around his coffee cup. "That's unacceptable," he said, his voice cold with anger. "No one, especially one of my officers, should treat anyone like that." He set his cup down with a sharp clink and stood up. "I'll have a word with him. He needs to be held accountable." Clara placed a hand on his arm, stopping him before he could leave. I don't want you to do anything drastic, Thomas. I don't want to ruin his life. But I do want him to understand that what he did was wrong. I want him to see that there are consequences for his actions, even if they seem small at the time." Thomas studied her for a moment, then nodded. "You're right. But if this officer isn't held accountable, he'll keep doing the same thing to others." The conversation left Clara conflicted. She didn't want to cause a scene, didn't want her husband to use his position to fix everything. But at the same time, she couldn't let the officer's actions slide. She knew that if she didn't speak up, if she didn't demand respect, others would suffer the same fate she had. She needed to make her voice heard. Meanwhile, Jack Stevens had no idea what was coming. The morning had passed uneventfully, and he was finishing up his patrol when his sergeant called him into the office. "Stevens, the chief wants to see you." Now, Jack's stomach dropped. Chief Matthews was a figure of authority in the area, but Jack had never met him personally. He didn't know much about the man except that he was known for being calm and level-headed. But the way his sergeant had said it, there was an urgency in his voice. Jack's mind raced with possibilities. What had he done? Had something gone wrong? He walked to the office, his heart pounding in his chest. As he entered the chief's office, he was taken aback by the sight of Clara standing there, her arms crossed, her expression calm but resolute. Chief Matthews was seated behind his desk, his eyes focused on Jack. For a moment, Jack stood frozen, unsure of what to say. But before he could open his mouth, Chief Matthews spoke, his voice low and controlled. "Officer Stevens," he began, his gaze unwavering. "Do you know who this is?" Jack's stomach twisted as he looked from Clara to the chief, suddenly realizing where he had seen her before. The name clicked. Clara Matthews, the wife of Police Chief Thomas Matthews. He felt a wave of heat rush to his face as the realization hit him. This was the woman he had humiliated the day before, the woman he had treated with such disdain, the woman he had so easily dismissed, the woman who, in the back of his mind, he had thought of as just another person. But now, standing in front of him, she was the one he had wronged. Clara's eyes locked with his, and for the first time, Jack saw the depth of her calm. She wasn't angry, not in the way he might have expected. She was simply resigned. It was almost as if she had expected this moment to come. "You made a mistake yesterday, Officer Stevens," Chief Matthews continued, "and I'm giving you a chance to own up to it. You treated my wife with disrespect, and that is not something I can ignore." His voice remained calm, but there was a cold edge to it that made Jack swallow hard. Jack opened his mouth, but the words wouldn't come. The magnitude of the situation was hitting him now. This wasn't just about him getting reprimanded. This was about his actions having real consequences. He had no idea what was coming next, but he knew he had crossed a line he couldn't take back. The silence in Chief Matthews' office was suffocating. Jack stood there, his throat tight, his heart racing as the realization of what he had done sank deeper into his bones. Clara was still standing there, her calmness in stark contrast to the storm brewing inside him. He had humiliated her, made assumptions based on her appearance, and treated her like she was insignificant. And now, standing in front of him, was the wife of the most powerful man in law enforcement in the region. The irony was not lost on him, and it stung more than any reprimand could. Jack tried to form words, but nothing came out. He opened his mouth again, but his tongue felt dry, his mind too clouded to think clearly. Chief Matthews watched him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "I want you to understand something, Stevens," the chief said, leaning forward in his chair, his voice steady but firm. "What you did wasn't just an error in judgment, it was an abuse of power. You took it upon yourself to judge my wife based on nothing but assumptions, and you took it a step further when you physically tried to remove her from a place she had every right to be. That's not how we do things in this department." Jack flinched at the words. He had always prided himself on his ability to handle difficult situations, to keep control, but now, The consequences of his actions were staring him in the face. There was no excuse, no rationalization that would make his behavior acceptable. He had crossed a line, and not just any line, but one that had the potential to ruin his career, his reputation, everything he had worked for. Clara, who had remained quiet until now, finally spoke, her voice calm but carrying a weight that Jack could feel in his chest. "I don't want you to lose your career over this," she said, "but I do want you to understand the impact of what you did. You assumed I was a nobody, that I didn't matter. You didn't see me as a person. That kind of thinking isn't just wrong, it's dangerous, and it perpetuates a cycle of disrespect that harms not just individuals but communities. If you want to be a real officer, one who earns respect, you need to recognize that everyone, regardless of how they look or where they come from, deserves to be treated with dignity." Her words hit Jack harder than anything the chief had said. It wasn't just about his mistake. It was about the systemic issue of prejudice, bias, and how easily people in positions of power could act on their assumptions without consequences. He realized, in that moment, how much he had let his own arrogance cloud his judgment. The rush of authority he had felt earlier, when he had dismissed Clara with nothing more than a cold command, now felt like a distant, hollow memory. He felt small, utterly powerless, as if the weight of his actions had completely deflated him. He finally spoke, his voice hoarse. I didn't mean to treat you that way. I made a mistake, and I can't take it back. I can't undo what I did." Jack's words felt inadequate. How could they possibly convey the remorse he was feeling? How could he fix something that was so fundamentally broken? The chief didn't look angry anymore, but there was no sympathy in his eyes. "This is bigger than just an apology, Stevens. You can't just apologize and move on. This is a test of your character. If you want to stay in this department, you'll have to show that you've learned something from this. I'm giving you a chance to make this right, but it's on you to prove you're capable of change." Clara looked at Jack, her gaze steady but not unkind. "I don't need your apology, Jack. What I need is for you to show everyone, starting with yourself, that you can be better. You need to ask yourself, who do you want to be?" The words echoed in his mind long after the meeting ended. As Jack left the chief's office, his mind was swirling with conflicting emotions. There was shame, yes, but there was also a strange sense of clarity. For the first time, he was beginning to see things from a different perspective. The reality of how easily power could be abused had been laid bare for him. Clara, the woman he had so easily dismissed, had shown him a truth he had never fully understood. Respect wasn't something you demanded through authority. It was something you earned through empathy, understanding, and humility. The following days were a blur. Jack was placed on temporary leave as the department conducted an internal review. The gossip and whispers among his colleagues were relentless. Some supported him, claiming that he had just made a rookie mistake, that he was still learning the ropes. Others, however, couldn't believe what had happened. The fact that a woman of such importance had been treated so cruelly made people uncomfortable. Even those who hadn't been there that day began to question Jack's ability to be a part of a system that seemed to condone such actions. Jack spent his days at home, staring at the walls of his apartment, replaying the events over and over in his head. The reality of his situation was undeniable now. His mistake had reverberated far beyond the confines of that one incident, and he couldn't escape it. What had once been a small, simple error now seemed like an act of ignorance that had caused ripples throughout the entire department and beyond. It wasn't just his career at risk anymore. It was his very identity. Who was he, really? What did he stand for? Then, one evening, the phone rang. It was Clara. "Jack," she said, her voice calm but carrying a weight of finality. "I've spoken with Thomas. He's not going to push for you to lose your job. But there's something you need to do, something you need to prove, not to anyone else, but to yourself. There's a community meeting tomorrow evening, and I think you should be there. You need to make things right, Jack. It's time you show everyone that you've learned something from all of this." Jack was stunned. It was clear now that Clara wasn't seeking revenge. She wasn't out to destroy him. She was offering him a lifeline, a chance to redeem himself. The enormity of her grace hit him like a punch to the gut. He hadn't expected her to be so understanding. The fact that she was giving him this chance, despite everything he had done to her, was something he didn't deserve. But it was also something he couldn't ignore. "Thank you," Jack said, his voice barely a whisper. "I won't let you down." The next evening, Jack stood at the front of a crowded community hall, facing a room full of people who had heard about the incident. His hands were clammy, his throat dry, but he knew this was his moment. This was his chance to make things right. It was a chance to start over, to show that he could be the man that Clara believed he could be. And maybe, just maybe, if he was lucky, he could find a way to earn back the respect he had so carelessly lost. The evening of the community meeting was charged with a palpable sense of tension. Jack Stevens arrived early, standing outside the large, aging building where the meeting was being held. He could hear the hum of voices inside, a mix of local residents, law enforcement, and civic leaders. The air felt thick with anticipation, but also something else, something Jack couldn't put his finger on. He had never felt this vulnerable in his life. As he stood there, he thought back to the last few days. The suspension, the internal review, the harsh whispers from his fellow officers. Some of them had been kind, offering sympathy for the rookie who had made a terrible mistake. Others had stayed silent, perhaps waiting for him to prove whether he was truly worthy of their respect. But Jack didn't feel like he deserved any sympathy. He had been arrogant, judgmental, and now he was facing the consequences. The worst part, he knew he had no one to blame but himself. Taking a deep breath, Jack pushed open the door and stepped into the hall. The room fell silent as his presence was noticed, the murmurs slowly dying down. He was used to the confident swagger that came with being the cop, used to people recognizing the authority in his uniform. But tonight, the power he held felt hollow. He was no longer the confident rookie on patrol. He was a man who had made a grave mistake, one that threatened to take everything from him. Jack's eyes immediately landed on Clara Matthews. She was seated at the front, alongside her husband, Chief Thomas Matthews, who sat with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Clara caught Jack's eye and offered a brief, but encouraging nod. There was no anger in her gaze, only a quiet strength that Jack couldn't help but admire. She had been right all along. This wasn't just about him apologizing to her. This was about him confronting the deeper issues that lay within himself. He stood at the back of the room for a moment, gathering his thoughts. When he finally walked to the front, the room's attention shifted to him. He felt exposed, like everyone in that room was waiting for him to fall short, for him to disappoint them again. He took a deep breath and began to speak, his voice steady, but tinged with a rawness he hadn't anticipated. "I'm sure many of you have heard about the incident that happened a few days ago," Jack began, looking out at the sea of faces in the room. "I've been given the opportunity to speak about it tonight, and I'm here to tell you that I made a mistake, a big one." He paused, swallowing hard. This wasn't easy. Nothing about this was easy. But as he continued, the weight of his words seemed to lift the burden on his chest, bit by bit. "I treated someone with disrespect. I judged them, assumed things about them that weren't true. I crossed a line that should never have been crossed, and in doing so, I failed at the very core of what it means to be an officer of the law. I failed in upholding the values of justice and fairness that this badge represents, and for that, I'm deeply sorry." The room was silent. Jack could feel the eyes of the crowd on him, some filled with skepticism, others with a quiet understanding. He could hear the faint rustling of papers, the shuffle of feet as people shifted in their seats, but no one spoke. Clara's steady gaze remained on him, encouraging him to go on, to say what needed to be said. "I know that words alone don't fix things," Jack continued, his voice gaining strength. "I can't undo what I did, but I can promise you that I will learn from this. I will be better, not just for myself, but for everyone I serve. This isn't just about a mistake that can be swept under the rug. This is about acknowledging a problem that exists in law enforcement, one that many of us may not even realize is there until it's too late." He paused, the gravity of his words settling in. This wasn't just about him. This was about a systemic issue that affected people every day. How many times had someone been judged by their appearance? By assumptions made in a split second? How many times had it gone unnoticed? It was a silent epidemic, and it needed to be confronted. "I've spent the last few days thinking about the impact of my actions," Jack continued, his voice growing softer but more heartfelt. "I've thought about Clara, and how she didn't deserve to be treated the way I treated her. But I also thought about every person out there who's been judged, dismissed, or humiliated simply because of who they are. I've realized that I'm not just responsible for myself. I'm responsible for the way I make people feel, for the way I represent this department. And from now on, I'm going to make sure that every interaction I have is one where respect and fairness come first." There was a long pause after Jack finished speaking. The silence hung in the air, thick and heavy. Then, one by one, people began to nod. Some of the officers in the room shifted uncomfortably, but Jack could see something in their eyes, a flicker of acknowledgement, of respect earned through vulnerability, not authority. Chief Matthews remained still, but his gaze softened, and Clara's eyes never left Jack, her quiet strength offering him the reassurance he hadn't realized he needed. Finally, a voice broke the silence. It was an older man sitting near the back of the room, one who had been quiet throughout the entire meeting. "You've got guts," he said, his voice rough but sincere. "I can respect that. Not many men would stand up in front of a room full of people and admit their mistakes." Jack turned toward the man, surprised by his words. It wasn't the applause he had been hoping for, but it was something more important. A genuine sign of respect, not born from his badge, but from his willingness to be real. The crowd murmured in agreement, and soon others began to speak up, sharing their thoughts. Some voiced their concerns about the department's need for change. Others acknowledged the difficulty of being in a position of power and the responsibility that came with it. But across the room, there was a sense of unity, a recognition that Jack's words had touched something deep within them all. Clara stood up and walked to the front, her presence commanding attention. She wasn't there to reprimand Jack. She was there to offer him the same grace she had given him before. "Thank you, Officer Stevens," she said, her voice calm but carrying the strength that had become her trademark. "What you said tonight wasn't easy, but it was necessary. It's a step toward making things better, not just for you, but for all of us." As she spoke, Jack felt a warmth spread through him, something he hadn't felt in a long time. It was the beginning of a change, a transformation that had started with a mistake, but would continue because of the courage to face it head-on. In that room, Jack realized something important, that being a real officer of the law didn't just mean enforcing the rules, it meant living by them, with integrity and humility. As the meeting drew to a close, Jack knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be people who doubted him, who would never let him forget what he had done. But there would also be people who recognized his efforts, who saw the sincerity behind his words. And for the first time, Jack wasn't worried about proving himself to anyone but the people he served, and to himself. This was the start of something new, the start of real change. The weeks that followed the community meeting were some of the most challenging of Officer Jack Stevens' life. His actions had set off a chain of events, one that had led him to confront not just his own biases, but the systemic issues that had existed far longer than he had realized. Every day since that evening, he had worked hard to live up to the words he had spoken, to make good on the promise he had made to himself and to the people he had wronged. Yet, despite his best efforts, the road to redemption was anything but smooth. The first test came in the form of a routine traffic stop. Jack had been on patrol for the first time since the public apology, his badge feeling heavier on his chest than it ever had before. As he approached a car that had been speeding, He could already feel his nerves start to build. The last thing he wanted was to repeat his previous mistakes. As he walked toward the car, he forced himself to take a deep breath, remembering Clara's words, "Everyone deserves to be treated with dignity." The driver was a middle-aged man, unremarkable in appearance, but the moment Jack saw his face, he had an instinct to judge. Old habits died hard. His hand hovered over his belt, as if ready to reach for his ticket book without thinking. But then something inside him shifted. Jack paused, taking a step back, and reminded himself that this man, like Clara, was not someone to be judged based on assumptions. He approached the car slowly, his voice steady, as he asked the man to roll down the window. "Good evening, sir. Do you know why I stopped you?" Jack said, his voice calm and neutral. The man looked surprised but not defensive. "I was speeding, officer. I didn't mean to." Jack nodded. "I'll need to see your license and registration, please." He didn't ask any further questions. He didn't make any assumptions about who the driver was or what his intentions might be. He simply did his job, in the way he was supposed to. When the man handed over his documents, Jack inspected them carefully, running the necessary checks, and then returned them with a simple warning. "You were going a little too fast, but I'll let you off with a warning. Please slow down next time. Drive safely." The man thanked him, relieved, and Jack stepped back, watching as the car drove off into the night. As the car disappeared from view, Jack stood there for a moment, his heart still pounding. He realized, with a strange sense of pride, that he had handled the situation with professionalism, without letting prejudice or assumptions cloud his judgment. For the first time since he had started wearing the badge, he felt like he had truly earned it. However, despite the success of the traffic stop, Jack knew that there was still much work to be done. The whispers in the department had not ceased. Some of his colleagues had supported him, acknowledging that everyone made mistakes, while others, including some higher-ranking officers, still believed he should have faced harsher consequences. He knew he had to prove to them, and to himself, that his apology was more than just words, that it wasn't just a reaction to the pressure of losing his job. It was a real commitment to change, to becoming a better officer. But the next trial was waiting for him in a way he hadn't expected. One afternoon, Jack was called to a domestic disturbance in a rough part of town. When he arrived, the scene was chaotic. A woman screaming at her partner, children crying in the background. It was the kind of call that could easily escalate if not handled carefully. As Jack entered the apartment, he was immediately confronted with the frustration and anger of the situation. The man, who was clearly intoxicated, was shouting at his partner, his words slurred and filled with venom. The woman, desperate to keep her children away from the violence, was crying, trying to keep them calm. Jack's first instinct was to assert control, to make the man stop yelling, to diffuse the tension in a way he had been trained to do. But as he watched the woman's face, as she tried to shield her children, he realized that his old methods might not work here. His urge to take control, to demand compliance, was at odds with the need to de-escalate, to approach the situation with care and understanding. "Sir, I need you to calm down and step outside," Jack said firmly, his voice carrying authority but without aggression. The man, who was larger and more intimidating, glared at Jack but didn't make a move. The woman stood between them, her fear evident. "Please," she said, her voice shaking. "Just don't make him angry. Please." For a moment, Jack hesitated. This wasn't the easy situation he had faced before, the ones where he could just issue an order and expect compliance. This was a human moment, fraught with emotion and danger. Jack took a step back, his tone softer. "I'm not here to make things worse. We just need to get this under control, okay? No one is going to get hurt." It was then that the shift happened. He realized that this moment wasn't just about controlling the situation. It was about understanding it, about seeing the pain behind the anger, the fear behind the shouting. Jack's instinct now was to listen. Slowly, carefully, he talked to the man, trying to get him to focus, to step outside where he could calm down. After a long, tense few minutes, the man finally agreed, walking outside with Jack while the woman gathered her children. The situation ended peacefully, without escalation. No one was arrested, no one was hurt. But as Jack left the scene, he knew that this was a real test of his transformation. In that moment, he had chosen empathy over authority, compassion over control. And it had worked. However, it wasn't just the successful handling of the domestic dispute that made Jack realize the depth of his progress. It was the reaction of the community. Word began to spread that Officer Stevens, once known for his arrogance, was showing a different side. People began to approach him on the street, offering their gratitude, or simply asking for advice, with a respect that had been absent before. It wasn't just about the apology anymore. It was about the daily actions, the small, quiet moments that spoke louder than any words could. But redemption was never a straight path. It wasn't enough to simply do better once and move on. Jack knew that the hardest test was still to come, the test of his character when things didn't go as planned, when he was pushed to the edge, when his old instincts threatened to resurface. The real challenge wasn't in making the right decision when he had time to think about it. It was in consistently doing so, even when the pressure mounted, even when he was facing personal or professional adversity. The internal review wasn't the end of his journey. It was just the beginning. Jack Stevens knew he had to keep proving that he had changed, that his words weren't just promises. They were actions that spoke louder than any apology ever could. He had learned the hard way that being a good officer wasn't about power or pride. It was about respect. Respect for the badge, for the law, and most importantly, for the people he served. And as long as he kept that lesson close, Jack believed he could become the kind of officer Clara and the community deserved. Months passed, and Jack Stevens had settled into his new rhythm. The journey from arrogance to humility was not a quick one, but it was a necessary one. The town had witnessed his transformation, and the whispers had finally stopped. No longer was he the rookie officer who rushed to conclusions. He had become the officer who took a step back, thought carefully, and treated everyone with the respect they deserved. The process had been slow, a day-by-day challenge of proving himself not only to the people he served, but also to himself. He had earned back the trust of his colleagues, some of whom had supported him from the start, and others who had watched from the sidelines, waiting to see if he would truly change. But even as he found himself more confident in his role, the past still lingered, quiet moments when he would catch a glimpse of his reflection in a shop window, moments when the weight of his past mistakes would settle on his chest. There were days when he felt like an imposter, when he doubted whether he had truly changed, or whether he was simply playing the role he thought others wanted to see. Those doubts never fully disappeared, but with each passing day, they became quieter, more distant. The redemption he sought was a journey, not a destination. One evening after a long shift, Jack found himself walking through the park, the cool evening air brushing against his skin. It was a peaceful night, the park nearly empty except for a few joggers and dog walkers. He had stopped by to clear his head, something he had done more often in recent months. As he walked along the familiar path, his thoughts drifted back to Clara. She had been a silent but constant influence in his transformation. It was her strength, her grace in the face of his mistakes, that had forced him to confront the reality of his behavior. He hadn't expected her to forgive him, let alone offer him the grace she had. But she had, and with that grace came a responsibility he had taken seriously. Jack remembered the first time he had seen Clara again after the community meeting. He had expected anger, bitterness, or at least some cold distance. Instead, she had offered him nothing but understanding. She had shown him a path forward, one where his mistakes were acknowledged but not held against him forever. The kind of forgiveness she offered was rare, and it had made him want to be a better person, not just for her, but for everyone he encountered. As he continued walking through the park, lost in thought, He was jolted back to reality when he saw a familiar figure up ahead. It was Clara, sitting alone on a bench, looking out over the small pond in front of her. There was something peaceful about her demeanor, a quiet strength that always seemed to settle around her. She had become a symbol of what Jack aspired to, someone who, despite the unfairness she had faced, had chosen to rise above it with dignity. He approached slowly, his footsteps silent on the grass. Clara didn't seem to notice him at first, her eyes focused on the water. It wasn't until he was a few feet away that she turned to him, offering a small, knowing smile. "You've been walking a lot lately," she said, her voice calm and steady. "Finding your way." Jack sat down beside her, his gaze following hers to the water. He wasn't sure what to say at first. The question wasn't just about walking. It was about life, about the changes he had made, about the long road ahead. He had spent so much time thinking about his past mistakes, about how to atone for them, but he hadn't spent enough time thinking about the future. "I'm trying," Jack said quietly, "to figure it all out. Some days it feels like I've made progress, and other days I'm not sure if I'm any better than I was before." Clara nodded thoughtfully. "That's how it goes, doesn't it? Change doesn't happen overnight, and even when it does, it doesn't make everything perfect. You're going to keep learning, and you're going to keep making mistakes." Jack looked at her, surprised by the honesty in her words. Most people, when they spoke about change, acted as though it was a straight line, a simple matter of making a decision and sticking to it. But Clara had always seen things with a clarity that Jack envied. She understood that change was messy, imperfect. It wasn't about being flawless. It was about being better than you were yesterday, even if yesterday was a very bad day. "I don't know if I'll ever be able to undo everything," Jack said, his voice thick with the weight of his past actions. "I've hurt people. I've made them feel like they didn't matter. And I don't know if I'll ever be able to make that right." "You don't need to undo everything, Jack," Clara replied gently. "You just need to make sure you're doing better now. The people you hurt, they're not waiting for you to be perfect. They're waiting for you to be real, to show up, to do better." Her words hit him like a revelation. All along, he had been thinking of redemption as something he needed to achieve, some grand gesture that would erase the past. But Clara was right. Redemption wasn't about erasing mistakes. It was about facing them, acknowledging them, and using them as the foundation for something better. For the first time in a long time, Jack felt a sense of peace settle over him. He wasn't going to be able to undo the past. He wasn't going to be able to change everything. But he could choose to be better every day. He could show up for the people he served, not as a perfect officer, but as a real one. He could do the work, day in, day out, and hope that, in time, the people he had wronged would see the change in him. Clara stood up from the bench, brushing the grass from her pants. "I'll see you around, Officer Stevens," she said with a slight smile. "Just keep walking, one step at a time." Jack watched her walk away, her figure slowly disappearing into the darkness. He felt something shift within him. Something that had been heavy and burdensome was now lighter. It was the realization that the path he was on wasn't about reaching some perfect destination. It was about the journey itself, about showing up every day, doing the work, and striving to be better than he was yesterday. As Jack left the park that night, the stars overhead seemed a little brighter, the weight of his past a little less heavy. He didn't have all the answers. He didn't know what the future held. But he knew one thing for sure. Redemption wasn't a destination. It was a commitment to change, to growth, and to always keep moving forward, no matter how difficult the road. And for the first time, Jack Stevens believed that he could do it, one step at a time.